opening statement of 5 minutes, followed by 2 rebuttals, and another 5-minute closing statement, followed by a Q&A session of about 10 minutes until the battery fails on the camera. Okay, so team 2, if we could get your opening statement, please.
It's like we're really short people. Hello everyone, my name is Jacob Mandel. I'm a third-year political science student here at San Francisco State, and like most of us here in the room, I'm a college student. I don't have a lot of money, and with rents rising in the city where we live, it's getting harder and harder to afford to live here. America's income inequality gap is growing larger and larger as the top 1% of earners are earning more than the 99%. And San Francisco is a prime example of this. Glistening white buses shuttling tech workers to the Silicon Valley pass us on a public transit system that is falling apart. More and more tech workers are flocking to this city, and lack of housing has caused a mass influx in rent, forcing students, artists, teachers, and activists out. The economy here is incredible, and we encourage economic growth, but it cannot come at the expense of the 99%. On a national level, the gap is growing further and further, and Republican candidates are refusing to talk about it. I want to make it clear, there is something profoundly wrong with our country when the top 1/10 of 1% owns just as much wealth as the bottom 90%. 58% of all new income since the Wall Street crash has gone to the top 1%. 7 years ago, the taxpayers of this country bailed out Wall Street because they were too big to fail. Today, 3 out of the 4 largest financial institutions in the United States are 80% bigger today than they were before we, the taxpayers, bailed them out. It's time to break these banks up and prosecute those who are responsible for the crash. To begin to close our widening income gap, our government must intervene and make some major changes. First, our education system is falling apart. In a highly competitive global economy, we need the best educated workforce in the world. It is insane and counterproductive to the best interests of our country and our future that hundreds of thousands of bright young people cannot afford to go to college, and that millions of others leave school with a mountain of debt that will burden them for decades. That short-sighted path to the future must end. We must make college tuition-free by taxing speculation on Wall Street. This would encourage huge economic growth, and this, not a wall, would make America great again. Another reform that we must make is that healthcare must be recognized as a right, not a privilege. Every man, woman, and child in our country should be able to access healthcare regardless of their income. The only long-term solution to America's healthcare crisis is a single-payer national healthcare program. We must also start further regulation of Big Pharma, and the fact that Martin Shkreli raised the price of Diaprim, an HIV drug, by more than 5,556% from $13.15 to $750 per tablet is the perfect example of why we need to regulate this industry. America is changing. We have a widening income gap coupled with a failing education system and a failing healthcare system. But we can change this. It must start with reforming Wall Street and stop the 1% from exploiting the 99%. Thank you.
Team 1, your rebuttal. Your intro.
Thank you, Jesus. So what is the current state of the economy? Those who think the economy is recovering will say that the unemployment rate is 5%. Gas prices lowest level since 2000. Consistent GDP gains, and also stock markets consistently going up since 2008. But this simply isn't the case. Although the unemployment rate is 5%, the labor participation rate is at its lowest level in 30 years. And if we even counted those who simply quit looking for work, the real unemployment rate will be 14%. So, is the economy doing well? No, it's not. But what should government do? My opponent may say that we can solve all economic conditions simply through government planning and welfare. But if government had the answer and had almost 50 years of policies promoting market stability and a war on poverty, shouldn't we expect them to read us a scorecard once in a while? Shouldn't they be telling us how the $42 billion spent on housing subsidies have actually reduced the need for affordable housing? Or shouldn't the federal student loan program have propelled millions of students into high-paying jobs? But the exact opposite is the case. It's no coincidence that the sectors of the economy that the government regulates, subsidizes, and controls are the most expensive and unstable parts of the economy: healthcare, housing, food, banking, and education. See, the government has no real incentive to relieve these issues, because to eliminate these issues is to eliminate the need for government. That's why we need a free market economy if we ever hope to get back to prosperity. This means low taxes, low regulations, and an absence of all government subsidies. The issues with our economy is not the fault of the market, it's the fault of government attempting to manipulate the market. Can any of us truly say that this is a capitalist economy when we have over 34,000 pages of regulations and 70,000 page tax code and thousands of corporate subsidies aimed both at the local and the federal level? According to the Economic Freedom Index of 2015, we were ranked 13th in the freest economies, with Denmark, Switzerland, Australia, and Canada ranking ahead of us. Where libertarians usually differ from mainstream economists is that we respect the reality of prices in all commodities, including money. Since the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the government has continuously devalued our currency. This means that the cost of living has gone up as the dollar is worth less. The problem is called inflation, and 98% of the value of our currency has been destroyed since 1913. This also has the effect of concentrating money in the top 1/10 of 1%. And the issue with my opponent's argument about the 1% is that they measure the 1% based on the statistical category, but not the people within that category. Actually, those within the top 1% fluctuates. It doesn't stay the same year by year. Those bankers that control the banking system, well, they directly benefit from the cheap money policy of the Fed. But it also allows for the government to run up deficits and pay for it by printing money out of thin air. And that's why inflation is not exclusive to free market economies. It happens more often in socialist countries. Look at Venezuela as a prime example and the consequences of inflation within that country. Now imagine an economy where the cost of living is so low, you could afford a comfortable living working only 20 hours a week. But that goes against what the government wants. The government does not want you to be independent. The government wants you to be dependent. And to rely on government is an illusion that we cannot afford to keep on aiming towards. Now imagine if the government did not bail out major corporations like we've seen in 2008. Imagine a country where almost anyone, could start their own business and become successful. Imagine if communities were self-sustainable because government didn't regulate and tax away their hopes and desires. But this is impossible when you have heavy taxation and heavy manipulation of the market at the federal level. Do we need an economic revolution? Of course we do. But how revolutionary is it for the government to control the economy? How revolutionary is it for the government to raise taxes? Isn't that what the American Revolution was fought over? Now, that's not a revolution. For thousands of years, the primary economic system that has governed mankind has been resembling towards socialism. That's why we need more free markets and more freedom. Thank you.
Shorter. Okay, so first of all, what we're advocating for is not exactly full socialism. We're advocating for democratic elected socialism. Key differences. So first off, I want to say that the San Francisco city and district is the second highest area for income inequality in the US. One way of measuring income inequality is the Gini coefficient, a century-old formula used by the World Bank, the CIA, and other groups to measure national economies. If everyone in a given place shares the wealth equally, the region scores a 0, and if one person holds all the wealth, it scores a 1. San Francisco is on par with a third world country, Rwanda. It ranked less than Sweden, which scored a 0.25, Denmark a 0.24, and the United States as a whole, which scored a 0.45. San Francisco scored a 0.50, and Guatemala scored a 0.559. The Brookings Institution recently found that the income gap between San Francisco's rich and poor is growing faster than any other city in the nation. The Human Services Agency data further illustrated the phenomenon. For every 1,000 person over the age of 25 in San Francisco, 7.3 are worth more than $30 million, far more than any other wealthiest cities, including New York, Los Angeles, and DC. The middle class, or those earning between 50 and 150% of the city's median household income of $7,200, has shrunk from 45% of the city's population in 1990 to 34% in 2012. Both ends of the spectrum have grown. The shrinking middle class has meant fewer families with children and fewer African Americans. Just 6% of the city is black, and the total population of African Americans is half what it was in the 1950s. According to the US Census from 2012, there are 50,652 more graduate degrees holders living here than in 1990. In 2007, 10.5% of San Franciscans lived in poverty. In 2012, 15% did. To receive state benefits and food stamps, a family has to earn less than 75% of the federal poverty level, which is $18,530 for a family of 3. The bare minimum to be self-sufficient in San Francisco is pegged at $57,658 for a family of 3, meaning many families make too much to qualify for assistance, but too little for to be self-sufficient.
1 minute.
One of the most daunting part of our economy is healthcare. The United States spends more on healthcare than Japan, Germany, France, China, and the UK, Italy, Canada, Brazil, Spain, and Australia combined. The United States ambulance industry makes more money in a year than the entire movie industry. Nearly half of all Americans use prescription drugs, and in 2013, more than over $28 trillion was spent on prescription drugs. Over 25 for-profit companies made over $1 billion in profit of prescription drugs in 2008 alone. To the 2008 financial crisis, which was caused by less regulation and big banks derivatives that were unregulated. Derivatives have become a uniquely unregulated financial instrument, and they are exempt from all oversight. Counterparty disclosure.
Sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off. That's time.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, and happy Super Tuesday. I'd like to thank my opponents who are taking their nice break from the Bernie Sanders campaign to be here, and I'd of course like to thank my colleague for his very interesting remarks. Before I begin with my own remarks, I'd like to note that my opponents do have a point that the education system in colleges with student loans is completely ridiculous. Student loans should be abolished. They are a disgrace in this country. Okay, now let's get to the point. The topic of discussion is, how is the American economy? The American economy is bad. Very, very bad. I don't care what the president says. I don't care what the Congress says. I don't care what numbers they cook up. The American economy is doing bad. It's been doing bad for 30 years. Let's look at the unemployment rate right now. If you're to listen to the White House and the numbers that came out last week from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you would think that the unemployment rate right now is 4.9%. That, of course, is if you take an unemployment rate that was developed by Democrats and Republicans so they can escape responsibility from the voters. If you go into a better unemployment rate that's more reflective of actual unemployment, you'll see something more like 9.9%, and even that is the low end. We can go up to 20%. More radical figures say up to 40%, but of course, we're going to dismiss that for the moment because that may be too radical. Now, where does this difference come from? The difference comes from U3 unemployment and U6 unemployment. U6 unemployment, which I'm using, that gives us the number of 9.9%, is the total unemployed plus all persons marginally attached to the labor force plus employed part-time. Now, what does that mean? That means, in short, people that are unemployed, underemployed, and discouraged. Okay, now let's get that out of the way so we know what the actual unemployment rate is. Now let's have some history. In 1990, the North American Free Trade Agreement was negotiated by George Herbert Walker Bush, President of the United States, leader of the Republican Party. 3 years later, that same trade agreement was signed into law by President Bill Clinton, backed by the Democrats, and pushed on CNN, Larry King Live, by Vice President Al Gore against Ross Perot, a businessman and 1992 presidential candidate who said that NAFTA would create a, quote, giant sucking sound of American jobs to third world countries. Now, if we look at what has happened over the past 30 years, it's one simple thing. Ross was right. Ross was very right. Now, if we go to 2010, Speaker of the House John Boehner, when he was Speaker of the House, he wasn't Speaker of the House yet, had a little refrain that he liked to use against President Obama. It was, "Where are the jobs, Mr. President?" Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you exactly where the jobs are. They're gone. They're not in the United States because Ross Perot was right. Where did the jobs go? The jobs went to China, they went to Mexico, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Costa Rica, they went to Korea, they went to Japan, they went to Vietnam, they went to Thailand, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the rest. That is where American jobs have gone. And why is that? Is it because of free trade? No, because the North American Free Trade Agreement was not free trade. That's what happens when government tells you, we're going to sort out the economy because we know how the economy works. We know how trade works. They don't. Trade is done by individuals. Individuals can do trade. Groups can do trade. Government, what can government even? Can't provide jobs. What can they do? They destroyed the American manufacturing base. You want to know how the American economy is doing? Go to Detroit. Go to Pittsburgh. Go to Cleveland. Ask those manufacturing workers, if you can find them,
I'm sorry,
how the American economy is doing.
You're over time. I'm going to have
to back up here. Let's go back to the original question. What's the state of the economy? It's really bad. Just like how my partner said up here. It's really, really bad. We have people on Wall Street who took our tax dollars and threw away our stock market. Our country is failing because we, as a country, have people who are sleeping on our streets because we have, for some reason, said that healthcare is not a human right, that education is not a human right. These are the issues of our country, and that's why we are failing. It's because we have failed to say that education and healthcare need to be fixed by government intervention. That's how these things work. That's how every other Western nation works. And we don't have that here. And coincidentally, we have people who are sleeping on our streets and people who can't afford to have healthcare. It's a fundamental right. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
So I want to point out some of my opponent's arguments. You know, they brought up San Francisco as being a city that has the highest income inequality, but it's the most liberal city. It has a healthy San Francisco, which is pretty much universal health care of the city. Every liberal city that has these type of policies are facing extreme poverty and inequality. You know, he brought up healthcare as a right, but do you have a right to someone else's service? Of course not. Now, there are better ways to go about healthcare, but it involves the market. Now, they brought up income inequality, and I kind of brought up how people within these different income groups fluctuate. I just want to bring up a couple of statistics from, for instance, the U.S. Department of Treasury. Among those with the very highest incomes in 1996, the top 1/100th of 1%, only 25% remained in this group in 2005. Another statistic, from 1992 till 2000, out of the top 400 income earners, fewer than 13% were in the same category more than 2 years. The thing is, they look at these groups like the top 1% owns X amount of wealth, but who is in the top 1% year by year? Actually, just recently, a famous basketball player named Allen Iverson, he went to bankruptcy court. He used to be rich. See, there are so many cases of people who are rich and then they lose money. So to look at them statistics as far as the top 1% owns X amount of wealth, it does not give credence to what the statistics really show. We need to look at how many people are in them groups for how long. And that's the issue when you don't understand economics. We have a term called economic illiterate. Now, the countries that have, universal health care or, quote unquote universal health care or has health care for all, they have a pretty different type of system. Actually, I brought up that Denmark, which is considered great for universal health care, they're ranked above us as far as economic freedom. See, what they do, they tax the people. They actually have a value-added tax, 80% value-added tax. So if you buy a car for $10,000, you're going to pay $28,000 for it because of the tax. They tax the people, but not the corporations. They regulate the people, but not the corporations. And it might sound bad, but it works for them because they get the needed revenue. They get the revenue that they need because of the free market. See, without the free market, you're never going to get the amount of revenue that you need. And you know what? Just to kind of prove the point as far as free markets and lower taxes, every time we've lowered taxes, we've actually gained more revenue. They talk about increasing taxes on the rich. But what is the purpose of that? I mean, are they talking about more revenue? Because when we did raise taxes, we actually received less revenue. But when we lowered taxes, we received more revenue. Like for instance, when George Bush lowered taxes in 2001 and 2003, we received more revenue than any period during the Clinton administration. Yes, we had a deficit, but that's because we spent more money than we was bringing in. It's a spending problem. Another example of it is when President Clinton lowered the capital gains tax rate from 28% to 20% in 1996. They expected a 209 budget shortfall from that particular revenue source, and actually they gained $172 billion. That was unexpected. See, when you lower taxes, you have more taxable income. We don't have a taxation problem, we have a spending problem because the government does not want to save money. Now, he talked about how Wall Street took our tax money. Well, Wall Street does not take tax money because Wall Street does not use force. Government uses force and gives it to Wall Street. So to give government more power over the economy is insanity, it doesn't make sense, and will not work. Thank you.
Just to start off with a couple of statistics about our education system. Yes, it is run by the government, but it is a poor system right now. Our nation's education assessment is largely based on graduation rate. In 2012, black students only had 69% graduation rate, and Hispanic students had a 73% rate, while Asians had 88% graduation rate, and Caucasians had an 86% rate. 30 years ago, America was a leader in quantity and quality of high school diplomas. Today, our nation is ranked 36th in the world, with most Western developed and European countries ahead of us, most of them social democracies. 1.3 million high school students don't graduate on time yearly. States with the highest rates are Wisconsin, Iowa, Vermont, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. 97% of low-income students rely on school for internet access. But 40 million students do not have high-speed internet access in schools. If the 1.3 million dropouts from the class of 2010 had graduated, the nation would have seen $337 billion more in earning over the course of the student's lifetime. We need a reintroduction to federal money in our education system. Schools lack the proper funding to function, and we need to borrow from our European allies' ideals and invest in our students. A proposed tax plan would cut a computer-generated high-speed trading, which is often accused of destabilizing the markets and giving an unfair advantage to large firms. I'm talking about Wall Street. These high-frequency traders make enormous amounts of money, billions and billions of dollars, and do nothing to any social value for the economy. They're just kind of a modern-day equivalent of skimming pennies of the till. Under a tax plan, trade would be taxed at a rate of 0.5% for stocks and 0.1% for bonds. A stock trade of $1,000 would thus incur a cost of $5. Given the huge size of the financial markets and the enormous volumes of trading that takes place today, such a tax could also raise a lot of revenue. A tax could raise as much as $340 billion a year over the next decade, according to Robert Poland, a co-director of the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts. Taxation on Wall Street is not only needed to fund the welfare of Americans, but limit the monopoly the 1% has on the 99%. Tonight you have heard arguments from both sides of the political spectrum, from our democratic socialism to the libertarian views. Libertarianism is complete free market, unregulated capitalism. What this does to an economy is take the morals and humanity out of the equation. It allows the concentration of wealth in the ever fewer hands, and this leads to an unfair amount of inequality that has time and time again put minorities as its victims. With the inequality we see today, living in San Francisco, how can we sleep at night knowing our neighbors are suffering, knowing that the middle-class families are forced from their homes because a new tech company has come to the Bay Area? How can we as a nation not see healthcare as a right, not a privilege? We are talking about lives, not driving a car. And how can we let the hospital executives continue to make millions of dollars in profit while consumers struggle to pay their ever-increasing medical costs? We need a more regulated economy to prevent another 2008 financial disaster. The 2008 crisis was not caused of immigrants or poor people. It was caused by mismanaged and deregulated free market capitalism. And who paid for the too-big-to-fail banks? The American middle class. So now is the time for Wall Street to bail us out and provide us with free public university access so we can once again be an intellectual superpower. Change takes place because people struggle. Thank you.
I thought this was a debate about the economy. Since when did this become a debate about the education system and healthcare? But okay, let me first dispel, let me go Marco Rubio. Let me dispel with this myth about education, first of all. They bring up we need free education. No, we need to take all the subsidies out of education. While we're at it, let's take all the subsidies out of energy, let's take all the subsidies out of healthcare, let's take all the subsidies out of everything. Just get the government out of all these subsidies. And speaking of Wall Street, let's get the subsidies out of Wall Street. Let's stop propping them up with the things that they want. Let's stop giving them things that they want. We can go to the housing collapse, which happened at the same time as the economic collapse. Maybe we shouldn't have had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, government programs propping up the housing market and giving people who could not afford homes that they couldn't afford. I mean, I can make that case. I can talk to you about how none of what my opposition has said makes really any sense in an actual context. I mean, we're talking about the government here. They want the government to provide free education. Government failed in the housing market. Why would we trust them with college education? Tuition has gone up 300% over the past 30 years. That's government education. But okay, let's get back to the economy, which, as I can remind you, is what this debate is about. The manufacturing base of this country has been crippled by the collusion of an unholy alliance of big banks, big business, and big government with big bureaucrats who don't care about the American worker. They don't. The opposition brings up minorities. Well, do you want to know where minorities are hurting? Talk to Michigan. Talk to Ohio, talk to Pennsylvania. As I mentioned previously, talk to Cleveland and Detroit and Pittsburgh. That's where the jobs have been lost. And who lost the jobs? Is it the Republicans, as they brought up in their first remarks? Yes. But it's also the Democrats. Remember what I said. George H.W. Bush might have negotiated NAFTA, but Bill Clinton signed it into law and Al Gore shilled it on the media. That is how the American manufacturing base disappeared. Let me give you a bit of a personal story. Not my personal story, but nonetheless a personal story. Last week in the United States Senate, there was a gentleman who worked at Disney. He was fired in January of 2015 along with hundreds of his colleagues. He had 20 years experience in the IT field. Why was he fired? Because Disney decided to hire low-skilled workers with less experience, and in the 90 days they had before they lost their job, they were supposed to train their replacements. Now, where does this all come from? This comes from the H-1B visas. Now, who is advocating for the H-1B visas? Well, the top advocates are Facebook, Intel, Microsoft, Google, Apple, and Amazon. Big tech companies. Are we going to trust them with what's best for American jobs and American manufacturing when they don't even want to hire American workers? They don't. And they don't want to hire skilled workers. That's why they fired people with 20 years experience and gave them 90 days to train people who have no clue what they're doing to take their jobs. Now I understand the urge to want to turn to the government to fix it. Trust me, I was in middle school too once. But when you get older, and once you learn how economics works, and once you realize that it's not just the Republican boogeyman, or if you live in a not-so-liberal area, the Democratic boogeyman, it's both of them. Both of them did these deals. Both of them sold out the American worker. Both of them undermined the core American economy. That is a problem that needs to be addressed. You want to talk about the poor Americans? How about we get their jobs back? You want to talk about the minorities? As I said, the biggest minority populations are in places that don't have the jobs anymore. And where did the jobs go? As I stated, they went to third world landfill countries instead of the United States of America. And think about this. Think about this. In 1991, we defeated the Soviet Union and ended the Cold War, and we became the one sole superpower. And what did we do when we had all that influence, when we had global hegemony? We sold it out, along with our workers. Is that what we're going to do when the cards are in our hands? We're going to sell them out?
That's 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank all of you for attending this debate, and I'd like to thank the opposition, and I'd like to thank my partner, and have a good night.
Okay, one time I'd like to just congratulate both you guys. Good debate. You both brought up statistics individually, each team, that I kind of wanted to meld together here to get a response from each team. So you had brought up the Gini coefficient, in which you had said, I believe that the United States was at 0.45 and Denmark was somewhat lower, although I can't recall the specific number.
Yeah, Denmark was at 0.24.
Okay, thank you. And then Nike, I believe you had brought up that Denmark is economically freer than the United States, and it seems to me that both of these work together to insinuate that with more economic freedom, we have more equality. And I'd like to just get one person from each team to just give their thoughts about that. That statement that with more economic freedom,
well,
comes more
I'll start out.
equality.
Definitely, the key to economic inclusion is to get rid of the barriers. What barriers are there that exist? It has to do with regulations and taxation and government control over certain sectors of the economy. What government does is that it dishes out benefits to certain corporate allies. We'll agree on that, but where we disagree is that they want to give government more power. What I say is I want more competition. I want to take government out of the equation for the most part. So yes, the less restraints and barriers placed by government, the more freedom, economic freedom you got, and the less inequality that you have.
That's not what we would argue. I would argue that with more economic freedom comes less inequality. I mean, look at how here we have this huge inequality gap, and we supposedly have this free market. We have this free market that just is going wild, and we allow it. I couldn't argue with Sweden and Denmark. I'm not really educated on their financial system, but I would say that I know that they are a socialist. They are socialist countries, and so they have probably much stricter regulations, but they seem to be happier, and they seem to have a much lower Gini coefficient.
I just want to point out that Sweden isn't rated freer than the U.S. Switzerland is, Denmark is, Canada, Australia. They're more economically free, less regulation, less taxation.
All right, thank you both teams.
This question is for Team 2. Now you say you're democratic socialist and that somehow this is different than big socialism. You said it wasn't just socialism, but I have to ask the question. Venezuela is a democratic country. Cuba has democratic elections. East Germany, when it still existed, called itself a democratic nation, and currently North Korea still calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. What makes you any different than a socialist, a standard socialist, or are you just saying socialism with the big smiley face sticker on it?
Well, first off, I mean, anybody can call themselves whatever they want. I mean, North Korea can call itself a democratic place. I call myself Jake, But no, we're not slapping a smiley face on socialism because we're not advocating the type of socialism that's in Venezuela. We're not advocating for the type of socialism that was in East Germany. And we're definitely not advocating for the socialism that's in North Korea. What we are advocating for is for a modified version of socialism that is not 100% full-on socialism, because I don't believe that full-on socialism works. But I also believe that 100% full-on capitalism doesn't work. So what we're not slapping a happy face sticker on socialism. We're just saying we think that there's a happy medium between the two, where we can have free healthcare, free education, but still have people able to live people can live their lives. Thank you.
Okay, hold on. Let me make a point on this. The difference between democratic and dictatorial socialist nations, on a political level, there is a difference. On an economic level, they're using the same economic system. That's a fact. Economic socialism works on both of those accounts. Now, one other thing I'd like to address is their very frivolous use of the word free. There is no such thing as free. There is subsidized. If you'd like to be more accurate, you can use the word subsidized. And if you want to provide free education, free healthcare, and free all this, we can do that. We absolutely can do that. We just have to settle with $20 trillion more onto the national debt. Now that is something that also has to be addressed, but of course you probably just want to kick the can down the road for that yet again.
We can just move on to the next question.
So my question is, I've heard from this side a lot about how the government should be protecting these morals and these values, and I kind of got the feel that you guys are kind of saying that the government is inherently good and moral. And you were also, I do recall you saying that that the problem with the United States losing jobs to foreign countries is based off of greed and not government. But I was just wondering, in what government system is there no greed? Or what government system doesn't run on greed? And if you can explain that, any examples of countries that do not run on greed?
Well, that's
specifically.
So that's a great question, and you're 100% right. There is no government system that does not. There is no system. Everybody is greedy. We can't get over this fact. That's why communism doesn't work. It's because everybody is greedy. But that's why I believe capitalism doesn't work, because because it allows for people to be more and more greedy without the regulation.
Well, I want to say something about that. I think that, you know, realistically, there are limits to what people can do. I cannot make a $250 billion because there's limits to how much I can make right now. One of the issues with centralized anything as far as economic systems is the same issue that you would have if you had a 4-bedroom house with only one electrical socket. Now imagine that scenario and then place 4 teenage girls in your house on prom night. Everybody needs to use the electrical socket, but there's only 2 outlets for it. That's an issue that you have with government. When power is centralized, you have competing factions competing to gain influence from that one power source. So that's why socialism doesn't work. The reason why free markets and capitalism works, because there's electrical sockets everywhere you go. When you open up the barriers, or when you break down the barriers of government, you have more competition. Yes, you do have greedy people, but if you have 400 greedy corporations competing for the same consumer, then you have market competition, you have lower prices, you have more accessibility. That's the opposite of socialism and democratic socialism.
Let me add to that real quick. We're talking about those barriers. My partner brought up those barriers that companies use within the country. That is an important thing, and those should be removed because those are an affront to free trade. Those are an affront to capitalism. Now take for example, Comcast and Time Warner Cable. Why don't they compete? Because they're not in the same market. They both went behind the scenes and said, well, you know, we're gonna have our cable business in this part of the country and we'll have our cable business in this side of the country and we're never gonna compete with each other. That way we can both keep our prices high. That's not the free market and that's not capitalism, and that needs to be removed. Those boundaries should be completely abolished, and that is how you get real competition with cable companies, with telecom companies, with healthcare, with education, so on and so forth.
Can do. Government, of course, can't run the VA.